This is a difficult time for many of us. We're isolated at home, we may not be able to do the things that we want, even assuming that we're staying healthy. Today I want to discuss cultivating contentment and how the Dharma can sort of frame contentment in a particular way for us and help us out. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, contentment. It's, I think, a large part of practice and trying to find a way towards contentment. And the Buddha had quite a bit to say about this, in either directly about contentment itself or about many, shall we say, virtues that we can cultivate that surround contentment. And there's one particular talk that the Buddha had with one of his monastics, a man named Anuruddha, about this very topic. And the Buddha and Anuruddha discussed what they call 3 thoughts of a great person, 3 kinds of ways of approaching life that a great person is going to have. And so what we want to do is look at these 3 and see the ways that they can, I think, inform how we might approach life nowadays. Before I get to that, though, I just want to say thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. If you're getting some use out of these videos, find them useful to your life, consider checking out Patreon to help support the channel and get some interesting and fun benefits in response, including some behind-the-scenes videos and other similar things. So the first of these thoughts of a great person is that the Dharma is for those of few wishes, not for those of many wishes. And I myself, I certainly understand and appreciate this because I used to be somebody of many wishes. Now, I've still got many wishes nowadays, but many fewer than I used to have. And I think what happens when we're young, oftentimes, for many of us anyhow, is that we're taken by the idea of acquisition. Wishing for more stuff is one approach. And then at a certain point in your life, you realize you have so much stuff. It's just everywhere. The other issue, I think, is wanting experiences. And there's some study that shows that having experiences makes us happier than owning things. That is to say, if we're going to spend our money on anything, it's better to spend it on an experience than to spend it on an object, unless we actually really need the object. But oftentimes, I think, for many of us, and I think I speak for myself anyhow, looking for experiences is, for many of us, a way of distraction, a way of papering over what really is a life that is dissatisfied. And that instead of actually looking that dissatisfaction in the face and trying to figure out what might really make us happy, instead we distract ourselves by, let's say, watching a movie or going out and walking in the park or going on a vacation. Many of us do that, of course, to distract ourselves, so we don't have to think about real life, quote unquote, when we're back in where we normally are. And there's obviously some benefit to this. I don't want to deny that. Going out for a walk in the park is healthy, and it certainly is nice to look at the trees and so on. Gives you exercise. But the deeper point here is one of distraction, of taking us away from what really makes us happy. And for the Buddha Dharma, I think if we read the Buddha Dharma and try to understand it, we come to the knowledge that fulfilling desires, in particular acquiring things, which tends to be the ends of our desires, really doesn't make us happy. It doesn't make us happy in the longer term. And distraction itself doesn't make us happy. It only makes us happy temporarily, but then it brings us back to where we were before. We don't really change anything. There's no wisdom gained, oftentimes, by these distractions. So the aim here is to pare these wishes down to those things that really will make us happy. And knowing what will really make us happy, knowing which of these wishes are really important to fulfill, is something that comes with wisdom, is something that comes with deep self-knowledge. And that, I think, is part of the Dharma. And so the Dharma is for those of few wishes. In other words, that they've pared the wishes down to those small number that really are beneficial for us. The second of these thoughts of a great person is that the Dharma is for those who enjoy seclusion and who do not enjoy being in large groups, being in company. Now, this may be an aspect of the Dharma which surprises you. I think it's the sort of aspect of early Buddhist teaching that oftentimes we get away from nowadays, and oftentimes later schools of Buddhism get away from as well. But I think we have to understand the point here. The point for the Buddha is that to enjoy crowds, to enjoy groups, is to get ourselves involved in noise, in tumult, in in popularity contests, in oftentimes conceit, the conceit of what's called known as the comparing mind, comparing ourselves to others. Are we better than them in certain respects? Are we worse than them in certain respects? Oftentimes a sense of dissatisfaction, either with ourselves or with others. Again, with popularity, looking to gain our group of friends, gain larger groups of friends than other people have. In other words, competition. And also, along with that, comes argument and dispute. And argument and dispute is something that the Buddha oftentimes derided. He did not believe that argument and dispute was of much use in the broader scheme of things, and certainly among people of the Sangha. I shouldn't say of course, but the Buddha would get into arguments and disputes with people of other belief systems. He certainly seems to have believed that they had their uses in a limited fashion, but enjoying the company of others in large groups is to tend to foster this kind of argument, and also foster equivalent sorts of things such as gossip, which is an element of wrong speech. Now, apart from gossip and argument and dispute, another issue I think with popularity or being in groups is this issue of popularity, of wanting to make people like you, which may mean taking on positions, arguing for positions, or taking on viewpoints that aren't really true to you, that aren't really accurate, because you want to make other people like you. And that's another aspect, I think, of popularity that the Buddha would not have particularly looked kindly upon. Now, when I say this, we have to understand that the Buddha's position here was nuanced. He did not think that we should remain in solitary confinement sort of for the rest of our lives. He did appreciate the benefit of having good company. Indeed, in one very famous discourse where the Buddha is discussing with his attendant Ananda, Ananda says to the Buddha that a good friendship is half of the life of practice, half of the holy life. He's extolling it. He says it's a great thing. It's half of the life of practice. And the Buddha says, don't say that, Ananda. Good companionship, good friendship is all of the life of practice. Because basically good friends keep you on the straight and narrow. They keep you on the right path. They give you great benefits. In another early sutta called the Rhinoceros Sutta, it's a very famous sutta where the Buddha talks about being alone, about how most people out there are really not going to be good companions to you for one reason or another. They're looking out for their own advantage and so on. And if it comes to it, it's better to be alone than be with such people. However, even in this sutta, the Buddha talks about if you find a true friend, if you find a really true companion who is truly a friend to you and who's looking out for your own good as you can look out for theirs, then you should go together. And so the Buddha is not suggesting that we should not have friends or not have family or something, but rather that we should be careful. That having a good friend is really a great boon and something that's often difficult to find. And so that we should spend time and effort finding our true friends, people who are truly good for us and who we can be good for as well, and rather than looking for popularity in crowds. And here we can see that perhaps our predicament here with the coronavirus may be useful to us. It may indeed allow us some temporary separation from others that may give us the time, the space to be more reflective about who we surround ourselves with when we come back to our ordinary life, or even nowadays, if it comes to using Zoom or whatever, who it is that we surround ourselves with, and who is not good for us, who perhaps we should reconsider, because for the Buddha, simply having a large group around you is not necessarily a good thing. And third, the Buddha says that the Dharma is for those who are contented and not for those who are discontented. I think it's Anuruddha who says these things, but the Buddha agrees to them, so they come to the same. The Dharma is for those who are contented. And here they talk about three, I believe this is the Buddha talks about three ancient traditions of Indian ascetics of his day and place. And we may know that Buddhism arose out of a culture of asceticism in ancient India, where it was a general cultural norm that people of a certain type, who perhaps were less conformist, would retire off into the forest by themselves and pursue an ascetic lifestyle in order to try to find wisdom. And the Buddha says that these people had certain kinds of traditions. First of all, that they were to be contented with any kind of robe, any kind of clothing. They weren't supposed to look for special or beautiful clothes, but rather be contented with any kind of clothing. Second, that they were to be contented with any kind of alms food. Ascetics in ancient India did not feed themselves, typically. Typically, they went on alms round. That is to say, they begged for their food from other people. This was part of what it was to be an ascetic. And the Buddha is saying here that they had to be content, or they were expected to be content with whatever they were given. They were not expected to be picky. In other words, it would not be good form for an ascetic to only beg from the houses of the wealthy people who could provide them with particularly tasty sorts of food. They were expected to be generous in their expectations from others. In other words, to go without respect to the status of the person that they were asking for food from. It might not be good food, but anything, they should be contented with any of it. And the third is that they should be contented with any kind of lodging. That is, they should be happy whether they're in a broken down hut out in the forest or in a very fine room. It shouldn't matter to them. That's part of being an ascetic. I should say also there's a fourth tradition, which is meditation, the tradition of being interested in meditation. But that's a sort of a separate issue here. But there's a wonderful nuance here that the Buddha emphasizes. That is that these ascetics didn't glorify themselves or put others down in these respects. In other words, they weren't looking for their own personal glory by being ascetics. They weren't putting other people down in being ascetics. Rather, they were looking for something quite different. The Buddha also expands upon this in a different sutta. He says, "A mendicant with few wishes doesn't wish, 'May they know me as having few wishes.' When contented, they don't wish, 'May they know me as contented.' When secluded, they don't wish, 'May they know me as secluded.'" That is, these ascetics aren't going on an ascetic path in order to make themselves famous as ascetics. That's not the point. In order to say, other people should know how ascetic I am. For a couple of reasons. First of all, it would be to involve conceit, or again, what's known as the comparing mind. Comparing ourselves to others, getting puffed up in the respect of being holier than thou. That's what the Buddha says they should not do or don't do if they're right ascetics. The second problem here is that kind of mindset would tend to lead to a one-upmanship of being ascetics. And that would get us off, at least for the Buddha, would get us off the middle path. If we remember, the Buddha preached a middle path, or taught a middle path here. A middle path in particular between indulgence and asceticism. That's what he began in his first sermon, at least as it comes down to us today. So we'll remember that the Buddha, of course, saw the problems in indulgence and self-indulgence. And a lot of ways, that's what we're discussing in today's video, is being contented without self-indulgence. So he saw the dangers in self-indulgence, that took us away from what was wise. But in the same way, the Buddha also saw the dangers in being overly ascetic, that people of his day, and indeed he himself before he became awakened, pursued very, very deep forms of asceticism, self-starvation, forms, if you like, of kind of penance, which were painful and difficult, but didn't lead to wisdom either. And the problem is that if we are going to indulge in asceticism, whether it be because of the coronavirus or for some other reason, if we're thinking, oh, I'm better than you because I'm staying farther away from everybody, what we end up with is going down a road that leads towards extreme asceticism. That the best person is the person who is the most secluded, is the most ascetic, has the least things, eats the least food, eats the worst food, that kind of thing. And that's not healthy either. Indeed, this kind of issue actually arose in the early Sangha with Devadatta, who was known as the Buddha's sort of evil cousin. And Devadatta wanted the Sangha to be more ascetic than the Buddha did. And they had quite a falling out, and Devadatta eventually had to leave. I did an earlier video on that. I'll put a link to it down below. But also, I think another problem here with going towards extreme asceticism is it actually gets us away from the whole issue here, which is contentment. The point of being content is to be content with whatever comes. If it's good, so be it. If it's relatively bad, well, at least we're fine with it. We would prefer something better, but we're content with the way things are. Whereas if we're getting towards extreme asceticism, we're really getting ourselves into a position where we're almost never content because we're never ascetic enough. We're always trying to one-up ourselves or one-up other people. We're always in competition. I think we know that kind of mind. It's often the kind of mind that comes up in a competitive kind of contemporary first world atmosphere, if you like, of always being in competition with other people and trying to outdo them or outdo ourselves. And in that direction leads discontent, which is the point of it really not being the right path. There's a fourth related issue, which I think is best brought out in something that the Buddha himself says in a different sutta, where he discusses how his own followers, the Buddha's own followers, aren't following him because of his asceticism. He says that he, the Buddha, is content with not having much food, with not having great robes, with not having quality food, with not having good lodging, and with not being in large groups of people. In other words, he's content with all of these things when they happen. But, the Buddha says, if the people who followed me, if all of my Sangha were following me because I was particularly good at these things, particularly ascetic at them, he says I'd have a problem. Because he says, although I'm perfectly content with small amounts of food, there are times when I eat quite a lot. I have a large bowl of whatever it is I'm given, or I'm given a lot, so I eat it. He says I'm content with rag robes, but sometimes I'm given robes by lay people, and they're beautiful robes, and I wear them. He says I'm perfectly content with not having very good food, but he says sometimes I'm invited to the houses of lay people, wealthy lay people, and they put down quite a repast. They give me, he says, rice that's been well washed. All of the dark rice has been taken out of it, so it's very white. It's very good quality, with very good quality sauces and so on, and I eat them. And he says that sometimes, he says, although I am content with, sleeping out in the forest under a tree, he also says, and this is kind of an interesting quote, Sometimes I even stay in bungalows, plastered inside and out, draft-free, with latches fastened and windows shuttered. And I love these kind of little vignettes because they give you a picture of what a wealthy lifestyle would have been like back in the Buddha's day. Of course, they didn't have glass. Glass windows were not going to come out for, hundreds, thousands of years. But what they did have was windows that were, or open windows that were shuttered against potential animals coming in the night and so on, that were draft-free, so that they were relatively, let's say, warm in a cool time of year. So what the Buddha is saying is that sometimes he stays in really nice places. And finally, the Buddha says that he's very content with seclusion, with being alone or with very few people. But he also says, sometimes I live crowded by monks, nuns, laymen and laywomen, by rulers and their ministers, and teachers of other paths and their disciples. So in all of these cases, if the Buddha's followers followed him because he was an extreme ascetic, he was extremely good at following an ascetic lifestyle, he would have a problem because they would be leaving him, because he was not really a top ascetic. He recognized that. Indeed, he preached that from the very beginning of his teachings, that asceticism is not the route here. The route is a middle way. And I think there's a lot we can learn here. That is to say that we're not doing this in order to be ascetics. That's not the point. There's nothing wrong with having a nice place to live or having good food. The point is rather one of looking for contentment, or as we said before, few wishes, having few wishes, being easily satisfied. That if the extent to which we have difficult tastes, we're going to make life difficult for ourselves. That the point here is one of searching for a lifestyle, of fostering a lifestyle that is relatively easily satisfied, where we can put up with a time like this where we don't have all of our normal goods, where we may go to the grocery store and not find what we're looking for because it's out. That's, I'm sure, happening to you as it's happening to me. Or that we can't go to the places we want to go. This is the sort of thing that we should learn, and we should foster a practice that allows us to learn to be content with that state of affairs. Now, I did an earlier video on minimalism, which is a similar kind of contemporary philosophy, thought, practice, which has, as I say, has similarities to that I'm discussing here in early Buddhism, and I'll put a link to it up on the screen. Thanks so much for watching. Remain content, I hope, and remain well, healthy, safe, and I'll catch you on the next video.